The pulpit was his throne, his voice unshakable, but now silence. Bishop Ellis, once a towering figure of faith and authority, is at the center of a scandal that threatens to tear apart everything he built. What happened behind the scenes isn't just about one man, it's about a crisis shaking the very soul of the church. Hidden betrayals, secret power struggles, and the kind of accusations that make believers question everything. Is this the fall of a leader or the beginning of a deeper reckoning for the modern church? Stay with me, because what you're about to uncover will leave you stunned and maybe even questioning your own faith in leadership. When a spiritual giant stumbles, the tremors are felt far beyond the church walls. Bishop Charles H. Ellis III wasn't just a pastor, he was a symbol of excellence, influence, and modern-day ministry. But now, that image is shattered. The scandal surrounding his name isn't just about personal failure, it's about the dangerous cracks within the very foundation of church leadership. From whispered rumors to public fallout, this isn't just another controversy, it's a wake-up call. And as his congregation reels in shock, believers everywhere are left asking, how did it come to this? In today's video, we peel back the layers of silence and expose the truth others have tried to bury. What really went on behind the stained glass? What secrets were protected in the name of reputation? This is more than just a fall from grace. It's a prophetic unraveling that has the entire ministry world on edge. From financial inconsistencies to moral missteps and hidden agendas, we're diving deep into the events that brought down a man so many trusted. And by the end, you may never look at the pulpit the same way again. You'll want to see it through to the very end, I promise. A man was boldly following in the giant's footsteps before the issue and the media. It was not merely a church that Bishop Charles H. Ellis III inherited. He was left a legacy. Greater Grace Temple, one of the most well-known Pentecostal churches in the nation, was established in Detroit, Michigan by his father, the late Bishop David L. Ellis Sr. Charles became the center of attention after Bishop David's death. Would the legacy fall apart and then, at least initially, rise again? Or would the sun rise to the occasion? Bishop Ellis did more than deliver sermons. He was constructing empires. With thousands of followers, several satellite ministries, and a nationwide media presence, Greater Grace Temple became a spiritual and cultural icon under his direction. Ellis was a performer as well as a preacher. In addition to ardent believers, he attracted politicians, celebrities, and influential people with his captivating delivery and polished showmanship. Notable people's funerals, important municipal events, and high-profile worship sessions that resembled award shows more than Sunday morning praise were all held in his church. His rise to the position of presiding bishop of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, or PA, a denomination with more than 1.5 million adherents worldwide, followed. Bishop Ellis was no longer merely a local Detroit leader at that time. He was now among the most influential members of the Black Pentecostal movement. However, power comes with scrutiny, and fame comes with pressure. People began to notice the fancy cars, the designer suits, the private aircraft, and the once unassuming church's corporate logo. Some saw it as a sign of God's favor. Concerns regarding ego, greed, and a growing detachment from the actual hardships of his flock were murmured by others. Nevertheless, no one ventured to publicly oppose him for years. Before fractures began to appear, Bishop Ellis appeared lofty and invincible. Initially, there were only faint whispers going on behind closed office doors and in the seats. However, those murmurs quickly became more audible and quickly spread like wildfire across the congregation. The situation at Greater Grace Temple was changing. It wasn't only spiritual either. Once renowned for his audacious sermons and inspirational teachings, Bishop Ellis started to garner notoriety for all the wrong reasons. People started to feel uneasy about his increasing penchant for luxury, which included lavish theatrical performances, exotic cars, and pricey outfits. Others said it was more about ego than anointing, but he insisted it was all part of presenting God in all his glory. Longtime participants began to pick up on little adjustments. The altar calls seemed more predetermined. The prayer sessions turned into theatrical plays. More aggressive requests for donations were made, and some claimed the ministry had become a business. The church was no longer just a haven for spiritual healing. With Bishop Ellis at the helm, it was starting to take on the appearance and feel of a spiritual empire. According to reports, A number of assistant ministers and staff personnel started quitting behind the scenes. Burnout was reported by a few, citing a change from servant leadership to celebrity leadership. Others alluded to more serious issues with Ellis's management style. There were even charges that strategic decisions were being made with profit, politics, and public opinion in mind rather than with prayer. The accusations that followed truly rocked the flock. Rumors of church finances being misused started to circulate. There were rumors that Ellis was using the church's funds to travel privately and stay in five-star hotels. Although he never publicly addressed these charges in detail, some insiders asserted that Greater Grace Temple's financial records were purposefully kept ambiguous and that there was little openness, even among board members. The most agonizing blow, however, came from within. Older members who had worshipped under his father, the fundamental foundations of the church, started to go. Some did it in silence. Others urged Ellis to go back to the traditional methods. However, their cries went unanswered. Ellis firmly believed that he was advancing the ministry and elevating it to new levels. In fact, the spiritual underpinnings were beginning to fall apart. Nevertheless, every effort was being made to preserve the public image. Large-scale broadcast events, dazzling commercial movies, and front-row celebrity guests. On the outside, everything appeared to be sparkling. However, the decay had already started below the pulpit. The dispute that would put Bishop Ellis under national scrutiny then surfaced. For what transpired on stage, not for his sermons. If the funeral of the great Arthur Franklin ever pushed Bishop Charles H. Ellis III into the bright glare of national controversy, it was that moment. The purpose of the lavish farewell ceremony was to honor a gospel icon and bring together cultural icons and spiritual giants. Rather, it served as the backdrop for an extremely awkward scandal. Nobody anticipated anything more than a heartfelt homage. When pop sensation Ariana Grande approached the stage to sing a heartfelt version of You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman. However, what transpired stunned millions of people worldwide who watched the live broadcast in addition to those in the chapel. Bishop Ellis put his arm around Ariana on stage after her performance. Furthermore, it wasn't merely a polite or informal gesture. His awkwardly high hand on her torso was seen on camera, particularly putting pressure on her breast side. You could see the uneasiness on Ariana's face. She drew away as she laughed uncomfortably, but Ellis hung on, as if unable to let go. Some viewers initially questioned whether it had been an accident. However, as slowed-down videos started to circulate, the awkward smile on Ariana's face and the force of Bishop Ellis's hold conveyed a different message. Twitter went wild. Reactions filled Instagram. Stack, respect, Ariana, and church were among the hashtags that started to gain popularity around the world. Major media sites, including CNN, The New York Times, and The Guardian, began reporting on the occurrence within a few hours. Critics were unreserved. Pastors, entertainers, and women's rights advocates all criticized the bishop for acting inappropriately in a church at a funeral, no less. Ellis's reaction, however, was possibly even more startling than the deed itself. At first, Ellis attempted to shrug the event off during a backstage interview. Regarding Ariana Grande's name, he joked that he believed it was a recent addition to the Taco Bell menu. That casual, culturally insensitive remark merely fueled the flames, leading to simultaneous charges of misogyny and racial insensitivity. What ought to have been a repentant moment became a nightmare for public relations. Ellis finally apologized in public after much public pressure, but many people felt that it was not sincere enough. "I guess I put my arm around her, but I never intended to touch any woman's breast," he stated. "It didn't set right that I might have crossed the barrier. Perhaps I was too familiar or pleasant." It was a gentle deflection, an almost passive attempt to dismiss what millions had watched live on television. Rather than a strong acknowledgement, the criticism wasn't limited to the outside. It has been alleged that members of his own congregation started to distance themselves. Ellis used to be viewed as a spiritual father by young women, but they started to doubt their safety. Even members of the gospel community who had long admired his work started to voice their disapproval and call for accountability, openness, and reform. Ariana Grande was no longer at the center of the controversy. It had come to represent a far more significant problem: unbridled authority in the pulpit. What should have been a celebration of Arthur Franklin's illustrious legacy turned into a public education on consent, boundaries, and the perilous conflation of spiritual authority with individual ego. Bishop Ellis continued to hold his position in spite of the criticism, the media attention, and the demands for discipline. There was no official action. There was no open investigation of the church. The storm, at least on the surface, was over in an instant. However, the harm had already been done. His formerly unwavering reputation was now deeply shattered, and a more sinister past was simmering under those fissures. One that included accusations of abuse, spiritual blackmail, and other charges that would shortly reappear with even greater force. This leads us to the following chapter. Although the Ariana Grande incident may have set off the fire, many members of the larger Grace Temple group saw it as the world's first glimpse of what they had been going through for years behind closed doors. What had started out as whispers in the cathedral hallways and hushed grievances following services started to explode into full-fledged testimony from insiders and former churchgoers. A growing number of people, particularly women, came out in the months after the public controversy to tell unsettling stories about their experiences under Bishop Charles H. Ellis III's leadership on social media, in anonymous interviews, and even in online forums. In Detroit's gospel community, one woman, identified only by her initials KS, made a long Facebook post that went viral very fast. She described years of covert spiritual manipulation, offensive remarks under the pretext of humor, and repeated breaches of personal space, especially during private therapy sessions. At first, you think you're receiving spiritual guidance, but it gradually evolves into something else, she wrote. More chilling were the remarks made by former church volunteers who worked closely with Ellis during church events. You're complimented on how you dress, how your body looks, and if you pull away, you're told you're being too sensitive or not spiritually mature. It messes with your mind, and you start to question whether you're overreacting until you see it happening to others too. A number of people who spoke anonymously to local Detroit news blogs detailed a pattern of behavior, including long embraces, inappropriate physical contact, remarks about women's appearance, and even pressure on young adult members to meet with him privately after church hours. One former choir member recounted an instance in which she was asked to meet with Ellis one-on-one under the guise of spiritual mentoring. You don't say no to the bishop, not without penalties, she claims. The conversation began with prayer, but soon became personal when Ellis allegedly inquired about her dating life, whether she was saving herself, and offered to be her covering. It was manipulative, and I felt stuck. It was difficult to ignore the pattern these accounts painted. One or two stories could be written off, but more and more people, particularly women, were now expressing similar feelings. It wasn't just smoke, there was fire. And to make matters worse, many of them said that they were either shamed or silenced when they attempted to voice these concerns to church leadership. The power imbalance was so great, they say, that it felt impossible to speak up. And it didn't help that Ellis's charisma remained intact in public, still giving fiery sermons, and that women were told they were disrespecting God's anointed, or worse, that they were lying or seeking attention. According to multiple testimonies, he continued to receive invitations to speak at national gospel conferences and to appear in televised services, and he had a large following of devoted followers who would not believe anything that was said against him. Some even blamed the women who came forward, accusing them of being jealous, resentful, or even devils attempting to bring down a man of God. A local Detroit-based podcast called Sanctified But Silence broadcast a multi-part series featuring several former members of Greater Grace Temple, but others, particularly survivors and advocates for church accountability, began to push back. These unvarnished interviews revealed names, dates, and heartbreaking details, exposing the alleged use of spiritual power as a cover for emotional, psychological, and even physical manipulation. A leaked internal memo from a former staff member suggested that the church was aware of at least 2 formal complaints made against Bishop Ellis before the Ariana Grande scandal, but that no formal investigation ever took place. This isn't about hating the church, it's about saving it, because if people keep getting hurt and no one speaks up, we're all complicit. This was the best way for one guest to sum it up. It's not just about one moment on stage with a pop star. It's about a culture that allegedly allowed someone to use his position and influence unchecked for decades. Instead, the women were reportedly encouraged to pray and forgive. By this point, it was impossible to ignore the question: how long had this been going on? How many people had suffered in silence? The testimony kept mounting, building a case not in court, but in the court of public opinion. Even as Bishop Ellis persisted in denying any inappropriate behavior beyond what he described as misjudged friendliness. However, the story doesn't end there. What followed would upend not only Ellis's reputation, but the church's very foundation. It's no secret that powerful church figures are under close scrutiny, and this is where the discussion takes a dramatic turn. Many of Bishop Ellis's supporters contend that what's happening to him isn't just a downfall, but a targeted takedown, a witch hunt motivated by power struggles, jealousy, and a society that is growing more eager to watch faith leaders fall from grace. Some see this as divine accountability, a reckoning, a moment where the curtain is being lifted from ministries built on charisma, not character, where the leaders who have forgotten the weight of their platform are being harshly reminded that leadership in the church is not just about gifting, but integrity, humility, and transparency. However, others see something deeper at work, where every sermon, post, and word spoken is weaponized in today's cancel culture. And it's not just Bishop Ellis, it's a pattern we've seen far too often: pastors leading double lives, congregations being destroyed, and the church's reputation being dragged through the mud, while the world looks on, amused by the drama. So what are we actually seeing here? A man being unfairly crucified by social media mobs, or a long overdue moment of truth for a spiritual leader who lost his way? Conclusion: the last word. The church is in the spotlight whether we like it or not. So let's face it, Bishop Ellis's downfall, whether you think it was deserved or overblown, raises serious questions for every church leader today. Are they actually leading the life they preach about behind closed doors, serving their flocks, or just building brands? And most importantly, what happens when the platform becomes more powerful than the purpose? And not just from critics or the media, but from God Himself. If this story teaches us anything, it's that character, humility, and true accountability are what will keep you standing. And perhaps what's happening to Bishop Ellis is less about his fall and more about a warning to those who are still standing before they fall.